I walked into the restaurant, the scent of rosemary and truffle oil mingling in the air as my heart did a nervous dance in my chest. Tonight was a big night, meeting Mark's parents for the first time. After months of planning our wedding, this was the last step before everything became official. I smoothed my dress, hoping that his parents would be as easygoing as he was. As soon as we entered, Mark's mother, Linda, materialized out of nowhere, her heels clicking decisively on the polished floor. She made a beeline for Mark, throwing her arms around him as if she hadn't seen him in years. "Oh, my darling boy, look at you. You're too thin. Are you eating enough?" Linda fussed, smoothing down his collar, patting his cheek, ignoring me completely. She pulled back, examining him critically. "Mark, honey, you know I worry. You can't just eat whatever you want at this age." "Mom, I'm fine," Mark muttered, giving me an apologetic look. "You remember Emma, right?" Linda finally turned to me, her gaze appraising. "Oh, yes. Emma, was it?" "Mark mentioned you," she said, as if I were a distant acquaintance. "Yes, it's lovely to finally meet you," I replied with a forced smile, extending my hand. Linda looked at it briefly, then instead wrapped an arm through Mark's and led him toward the table, leaving me trailing behind. Once we were seated, Linda and Mark's father, Robert, took control of the evening. Linda immediately motioned for the waiter. "Yes, we'll have the oysters to start, and bring my son a steak, rare, and make sure it's lean, nothing too fatty." "I thought I might actually try the pasta," Mark started, but Linda interrupted. "Oh, honey, pasta isn't good for your digestion. Trust me, you'll thank me later," she insisted, not even glancing at the menu. I watched Mark nod submissively, and a red flag shot up in my mind. "Actually, I'll go with the pasta," I said, trying to inject a bit of lightness. "It's been a long day, and comfort food sounds perfect." Linda looked at me as if I'd ordered something radioactive. "Pasta? Really?" she sniffed, eyebrows raised. "I wouldn't recommend it." "Oh, don't worry. I'm adventurous," I said, smiling sweetly, while suppressing the urge to roll my eyes. But instead of backing off, Linda seemed to take it as a challenge. "Adventurous is one thing, dear. Ignoring good advice is another," she replied, eyes narrowing just slightly. Robert cleared his throat, folding his hands on the table. "Emma," he began, his voice more serious than the situation warranted. "Tell me, how do you plan to take care of Mark? He's used to certain comforts." He glanced at Linda, who nodded in agreement, giving me an expectant look. I blinked, surprised by the interrogation. "Well, I think Mark and I both take care of each other," I said, a hint of steel creeping into my tone. "We're a team." "A team," Robert repeated with a slight smirk. "You know, marriage isn't a game, Emma. Mark deserves the best." "Of course he does," I replied, meeting Robert's gaze, "and so do I." At that, Mark shifted uncomfortably. Dad, Emma's great. You don't need to." "Mark, honey, let your father finish," Linda interjected, dismissing him with a wave. She turned her gaze back to me. "For instance, have you considered Mark's schedule? He has early mornings. You'll need to adjust meals, laundry, and, of course, his clothes must be ironed. No wrinkles. Ironed clothes? Scheduled meals?" I glanced at Mark, waiting for him to say something, anything, to push back on this outdated wife as domestic caretaker spiel. But he just sat there, eyes down, nodding. "I think Mark can manage a wrinkle or two," I replied with a light laugh, trying to keep the mood from souring. "Oh, but that's what a supportive wife is for," Linda insisted, looking at me with thinly veiled disapproval. "Mark's future is very important to us, Emma. We want to be sure he's with someone who understands him." Something in me snapped. I leaned in, lowering my voice just enough to keep it polite. "I understand Mark very well, enough to know he doesn't need someone monitoring every detail of his life. Mark's an adult." Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. The tension at the table was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. I could feel Mark squirm beside me, yet he still said nothing. As the meal continued, Linda and Robert took turns advising me on how to best serve their son's needs. Each tip another reminder that they expected a devoted housewife, not an equal partner. Finally, when the check arrived, Linda barely looked up. "Let's just split this evenly, shall we?" she suggested, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. My jaw clenched. I had ordered a simple pasta dish, while they had enjoyed oysters, steak, and wine. Mark, meanwhile, stayed silent, his eyes fixed firmly on his glass. That was it. I took a steadying breath and pulled out my wallet, signaling the waiter. "I'll just pay for my meal," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "Thank you." Emma, really, Mark began, finally speaking up, but I shook my head. It's fine, I said, offering him a small, sad smile. I was seeing everything clearly now, and there was no going back. I knew that if I stayed, I'd be stuck in a life where I was a supporting character in someone else's script. And I was done with that. As I left the restaurant, I heard Linda mutter, "Well, that was dramatic." For once, I didn't care what she thought. I was free, and that freedom tasted far better than anything on that restaurant's menu. After that disastrous dinner, the idea of going back to a life with Mark and his overbearing family felt as appealing as reheated coffee. I knew I'd made the right choice, but that didn't make the initial days any easier. I wandered around my apartment, still half dazed by the fact that I was no longer engaged. There were no wedding invitations to send, no dress fittings to endure, no mother-in-law critiques to mentally prepare for. In a way, I was in a free fall. Carrie, my best friend and self-appointed life coach, was having none of my moping. "Emma," she declared over the phone one Friday night, "you're coming out with me tonight. You need a change of scenery, something exciting." "Oh, you mean something to distract me from the ghost of wedding planning?" I replied with a sigh. "Exactly. Enough with that zombie bride look. Put on something hot. I'm talking revenge dress level hot." That's how I found myself standing in front of the mirror, eyeing my little black dress that had been gathering dust for way too long. I slipped it on, and a small spark of confidence flickered. I remembered a version of myself who wasn't about meticulously ironing shirts or scheduling meals. She was fun, bold, spontaneous. Tonight, I'd channel her. The bar was loud and bustling when we arrived. A jazz band played in the background, and I felt the rhythm pulse through me. Carrie handed me a cocktail, a neon pink concoction that she claimed was called the Heartbreaker. Fitting, I thought, as I took a sip. Tangy and strong, with a punch that lingered. "So," Carrie leaned in, eyeing me intently. "How are you really feeling?" I hesitated. Relieved? Mostly. But there's a part of me that's just... I paused, trying to find the right word. Angry, I guess? Angry that I wasted so much time trying to be what they wanted. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Em," Carrie said, squeezing my hand. "Sometimes you have to lose yourself a little to know exactly who you want to be." Just as I was about to answer, a smooth voice interrupted us. "Ladies, can I buy you two around?" We looked up, and there he was, a tall, relaxed guy with a quick smile and an air of confidence that felt effortless. He was the kind of person you'd notice in a crowded room, someone who didn't have to try too hard. "Depends," Carrie said, smirking. "Are you a Mark or are you a Nick?" The guy chuckled. "I'm a Nick. Definitely a Nick." He extended his hand to me. "Nick Carlson." I raised an eyebrow, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you, Nick. I'm Emma." "What brings you two out tonight?" Nick asked as the bartender placed another round of Heartbreakers in front of us. "Oh, you know, a little celebration," Carrie said slyly. "Emma here just got out of an engagement." "Really?" Nick looked at me, a glint of curiosity in his eye. "Congratulations or condolences?" "Congratulations," I said firmly, feeling a surge of confidence. Nick grinned. "Glad to hear it. To freedom, then." He raised his glass, and we all clinked, laughter bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me. It felt exhilarating to be in the moment, free from the weight of expectations. We spent the rest of the evening swapping stories, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. Nick's humor was sharp and easy, and his questions were genuinely curious, never prying. He didn't ask about the engagement, or my past, or what I wanted from my next relationship. Instead, he kept things light, bringing out stories of his own, and inviting me into a conversation that felt like a dance, one where no one was leading or following, just enjoying the rhythm. At one point he leaned in, voice low. "So, Emma, what's the plan now?" I tilted my head. "The plan?" "Yeah," he said, his eyes twinkling. "You've got this fresh start. What's on your freedom bucket list?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't really thought about it that way. Honestly, I think I just want to be me. No expectations, no molds to fit into. "I like that," Nick said, nodding. "People spend their whole lives trying to figure out who they are. Most don't get there." I smirked, taking a sip of my drink. "So you're saying I'm ahead of the curve?" "Way ahead," he replied, grinning. "In fact, you might need a tour guide for this new version of you." Carrie rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, brother, look at you two, already plotting world domination." We laughed, but Nick's words stuck with me. There was something liberating about the idea of redefining my future without the weight of anyone's expectations but my own. As the night wound down, Nick turned to me. You know, Emma, I don't know much about your past, but I can tell you've got a story in you. One you're just starting to write. I think you're right, I replied, my heart unexpectedly light. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a script I had to follow. It felt like an open page. And as I watched Nick's easy smile, I wondered what new chapters might come next. The days after that night out with Carrie and Nick slipped by in a blur of laughter and a growing sense of liberation. Nick and I started meeting up, casual, unplanned moments that somehow always turned into hours of conversation. He was different from anyone I'd ever known. He didn't take himself too seriously, but he had a way of cutting through the nonsense that left me feeling both seen and challenged. And the more time I spent with him, the more I realized how much I'd missed having a real connection with someone. One that didn't come with a pre-approved checklist or hidden expectations. One evening, we met at a little diner just outside the city. The kind of place with leather booths and neon signs that felt like it hadn't changed in 50 years. Nick was already there, seated in a booth by the window, a coffee cup in his hand. When he saw me, he broke into a grin that made my heart do a little flip. Glad you could make it, he said, as I slid into the booth across from him. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, smiling back. Besides, I'm curious to see if the best pancakes in town claim is actually true. He laughed. Oh, trust me, these pancakes are legendary. They might just change your life. A waitress came by to take our order, and as soon as she left, Nick leaned forward, looking at me with that mischievous glint in his eye. All right, Emma, he began, tapping his fingers on the table. You've been single for a few weeks now. Had any big revelations? I chuckled, stirring my coffee. Revelations? Maybe just that I've been way too serious. It's like I forgot how to enjoy things. Too serious? I'd never guessed that, he said, feigning shock. Oh, don't even start, I shot back, laughing. Okay, but what about you? You seem like you're living in the moment, but I get the feeling you've got a little bit of a realist streak, let's say. He raised an eyebrow. Realist, huh? I'll take that as a compliment. Maybe it is, I replied, studying him. What's your philosophy then, Mr. Realist? Simple, he said, sitting back and crossing his arms. Life's too short for anything that doesn't make you feel alive. If something's dragging you down, cut it loose. Is that why you're single? I teased, half curious. He smirked, not missing a beat. Maybe, or maybe I'm just holding out for someone who can keep up. Our banter was interrupted by the arrival of our food, and true to Nick's word, the pancakes were incredible. We spent the next half hour laughing, sharing ridiculous stories about past dates and weird experiences. But then, as the plates cleared, the conversation turned serious. So, what happened with you and Mark? Nick asked quietly, his gaze steady. I paused, caught off guard by the question, but there was no judgment in his tone, just curiosity. Honestly, I said, setting my fork down, I think I was in love with an idea more than the actual person. The idea of a stable life, the wedding, the perfect match checklist. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what I really wanted. And what do you want? He asked, his eyes never leaving mine. The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken possibilities. I want someone who sees me, I said finally, the words coming out softer than I'd expected. Someone who doesn't try to change me or mold me into some ideal. Just someone real. Nick nodded, a slight smile playing on his lips. Sounds like you've got pretty good taste. I laughed, rolling my eyes. Don't get too full of yourself. The waitress dropped off the check, and before I could reach for my wallet, Nick slid the bill over to his side. I've got this one, he said, his voice low. Oh, come on, I protested. This wasn't even an official date. He looked at me with a grin that was equal parts charm and challenge. Who says it wasn't? I felt my face flush, and I couldn't help but smile back. As we walked out of the diner, he looked up at the sky, his hands in his pockets. It's funny, you know, he said, almost to himself. How life throws people together when they're least expecting it. Yeah? I said, nudging him with my shoulder. You're saying fate brought us to a pancake diner at midnight? Maybe, he replied, eyes twinkling. Or maybe it was just good luck. We walked down the quiet street, the city lights casting a warm glow over us. I could feel the tension building between us, unspoken words and possibilities hanging in the air. Part of me wanted to close the gap between us, to just see where it might lead, but another part was cautious, wary of rushing into something new. "Nick," I said, stopping in my tracks. "I have to ask, are you always this charming, or is it just me?" He turned to face me, his expression playful but earnest. "Emma, I don't know what it is about you. Maybe it's that you're finally free to be who you want. Or maybe it's that, for the first time, I'm interested in finding out who that is." I felt my heart skip a beat. He wasn't just flirting. He was pulling me into something deeper, something real. "Guess I'd better make sure you don't find out too much too fast," I replied, grinning. He laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, I like a good mystery, but fair warning, I'm pretty good at solving them." As he walked me to my car, the night air felt electric. I'd entered that diner thinking this would be a casual evening, a simple distraction. But as I drove home, Nick's words echoed in my mind, a tantalizing promise of something genuine and thrilling. I was finally starting to feel like myself again, a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. Confident, spontaneous, and for the first time, completely free. Nick and I had been spending more time together, and though we hadn't put any labels on it, there was something undeniably real brewing between us. It was exciting, easy, and most importantly, it felt right. So when I got a text from Mark one Saturday morning, it hit me like a brick. "Hey, Emma, been thinking about you. Can we talk?" I stared at the message, feeling my stomach churn. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part of me was curious. What could he possibly have to say? I decided to meet him at a coffee shop later that day, if only to satisfy my own curiosity. When I arrived, I spotted him at a corner table, looking awkward and a little unsure of himself. His face lit up when he saw me, but I couldn't help but feel a sense of detachment. "Emma," he said, standing up as I approached. "It's good to see you." "You too, Mark," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. We sat down, and he looked at me with a mixture of regret and hope. I've been doing a lot of thinking since we broke up," he started, running a hand through his hair. "I know I didn't stand up for you that night with my parents, and I should have. I'm sorry." I took a deep breath, deciding to cut through the pleasantries. "Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the apology, but it's not just about that dinner. It's about everything. I don't think we were a good fit." Mark leaned forward, looking desperate. "I can change, Emma. I've realized how much I let them control my life, and I'm ready to stand up for myself. For us." Just then, the door opened, and I felt my heart lurch as Linda walked in, glancing around before spotting us. She marched over, a forced smile plastered on her face. "Oh, Emma, it's so good to see you," she said, taking the seat next to Mark as if she'd been invited. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd say hello. Mark, you didn't tell me you'd be meeting with Emma." Mark looked flustered, stammering something about it being a last-minute thing. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Of course, she knew. This wasn't a coincidence. "Actually, I'm glad you're here, Linda," I said, deciding to lean into the moment. "Mark and I were just talking about boundaries and how important they are in relationships." Linda blinked, clearly not expecting that. "Boundaries? Well, darling, you know, I've always believed that family should be close. Mark's happiness is my happiness, after all." "Exactly," I replied, giving her a cool smile, "which is why it's so important that he learns to be happy on his own." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Are you saying that Mark's happiness depends on not being with his family?" Mark squirmed, and I could see he was caught in his usual bind, trying to please his mother while still wanting to convince me he'd changed. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I'm saying that if Mark and I are to have any kind of relationship, he needs to make decisions for himself," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Linda glanced at Mark, a look of alarm crossing her face. "Mark, honey, you're not actually considering putting some distance between us, are you?" Mark hesitated, clearly torn. "Mom, I think Emma has a point. Maybe we all need some boundaries." Linda's face tightened, and she turned to me with barely concealed disdain. "I'm not sure this new approach is healthy, Mark. Family should be a priority, and I would hate to see you drift apart from us just because of—" She trailed off, letting the implication hang between us. I glanced at Mark, waiting for him to say something, to defend his own autonomy. But he just sat there, fidgeting, his mouth opening and closing as if he were grasping for words that wouldn't come. Just then, my phone buzzed, and I glanced down to see a message from Nick. "How about we grab a drink later? I've got a surprise for you." I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. It was the perfect reminder of how far I'd come and how far I still wanted to go. "Mark," I said, standing up and grabbing my bag. "I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but I think it's too late for us. I need someone who's, well, already a partner, not someone who has to choose between his family and me." Mark looked stricken, but he didn't protest. Linda, however, looked ready to pounce. "You know, Emma," she said, her voice cool and calculated, "not everyone will put up with such high standards. Sometimes compromise is what makes relationships last." I met her gaze, unfazed. "And sometimes self-respect is what makes people happy." Without another word, I turned and walked out of the coffee shop, feeling the weight of the past finally lift off my shoulders. I knew now, with absolute clarity, that I'd made the right choice. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. I felt free. Later that evening, I met Nick at a bar where he was waiting with a mischievous grin. "What's this surprise you mentioned?" I asked, laughing. "Oh, just a little something to celebrate your newfound freedom," he replied, holding up 2 tickets. "How do you feel about a weekend road trip?" "A road trip?" I said, surprised. "Yep," he said, leaning closer, eyes twinkling. "No plans, no expectations, just us, a car, and whatever adventure we find along the way." It was spontaneous, a little crazy, and exactly what I needed. "I'm in," I replied, feeling a thrill run through me. Nick raised his glass, grinning. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," I echoed, clinking my glass with his, knowing that whatever lay ahead, I was finally ready for it. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of a little roadside inn, casting a warm glow over the room. Nick was already up, leaning against the window with a cup of coffee, his silhouette framed by the sunlight. We'd been on the road for 2 days now, taking turns choosing our destinations, getting lost, finding little gems along the way. It was, without question, the most fun I'd had in years. "Morning, Sleeping Beauty," he said, glancing over with a smirk as I stretched. "You ready for our next stop?" I grinned, rolling out of bed. "Depends. Are we going somewhere with actual food? That last gas station sandwich was an experience." "Only the best for you," he said, chuckling. "I've got it all mapped out. There's a breakfast diner about 30 minutes from here that supposedly makes legendary waffles." "Legendary, huh?" "You have high standards," I teased, padding over to grab a cup of coffee for myself. "Only for the important things," he replied, eyes twinkling. We hit the road soon after, a playlist of old-school rock songs blasting as the miles rolled by. I leaned my head out the window, the wind whipping through my hair, and I felt that incredible, giddy rush of freedom. It was as if I'd shed years of trying to fit into a mold that was never meant for me. When we finally pulled up to the diner, it was exactly the kind of place you'd see in a movie. A squat, neon-lit building with a couple of locals sitting at the counter and the smell of fresh coffee hanging in the air. As soon as we walked in, the waitress, a woman in her 60s with a beehive hairdo, greeted us with a wink. "You two look like trouble," she said, grinning as she poured us coffee. "What'll it be?" "2 plates of your legendary waffles," Nick said, giving me a playful nudge. "Legendary, huh?" she said, arching an eyebrow. "I'd call them downright magical." As we waited for our food, Nick leaned back in the booth, looking at me thoughtfully. "You know, Emma, I can't believe it's only been a few weeks since that night at the bar." "Feels like a lifetime," I admitted, smiling. "I don't think I've ever felt so myself." "That's what I like about you," he said, his voice softening. "You're finally living like it's just you out here. No pressure, no expectations." I glanced away, feeling a strange mix of vulnerability and excitement. I guess I spent too long trying to fit into other people's lives. Now, I just want to see where mine will take me. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with that intense gaze of his. "Emma, have you ever thought about making this," he gestured between us, "a little more permanent?" I laughed, thinking he was joking. "What, are you proposing a road trip partnership?" His expression didn't change. "Actually, yeah, something like that. Maybe not the whole moving in together thing yet, but what if we keep doing this? You and me, just living in the moment, seeing where it takes us?" I felt my heart skip a beat. Are you serious? I asked, my voice coming out softer than I'd intended. Dead serious, he replied, his eyes searching mine. Emma, I don't do things halfway. You're not just a distraction, and this road trip isn't just a fling for me. I think you're incredible, and I don't want to lose this, whatever it is. For a moment, I was speechless. No one had ever looked at me like that, with respect, admiration, and a kind of honesty that felt both comforting and terrifying. Nick, I don't know what to say, I managed, finally finding my voice. This is all happening so fast. I know, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. And I'm not asking for forever. I'm just asking you to take a leap with me. We can take it slow, one day at a time. No pressure, no expectations. I looked down at our hands, his fingers warm and steady around mine. Every instinct told me to be cautious, but every fiber of my being wanted to throw caution to the wind. He wasn't asking me to be someone I wasn't. He was asking me to be exactly who I wanted to be. I'll admit, you're making it hard to say no, I said, giving him a wry smile. He laughed, squeezing my hand. That's the idea. At that moment, the waitress arrived with our waffles, setting down 2 plates of fluffy, golden goodness. She looked between us, eyes twinkling with a knowing smile. Well, don't you two look cozy? Looks like you've got something good going on here. Just maybe, I said, smiling at Nick, my heart racing in the best possible way. We ate our waffles, laughing and sharing bites, and every moment felt like a scene out of a movie. But as we got back into the car, Nick looked over at me with a mischievous grin. I've got one more stop in mind before we head back, he said, turning the key in the ignition. Oh, you've been holding out on me? Yep, he replied, eyes gleaming with intrigue. Trust me, this one's worth it. The drive took us through winding roads and past sprawling fields, and just when I thought we were heading nowhere, we pulled up to a secluded overlook with a panoramic view of the mountains, painted in shades of orange and purple by the setting sun. Nick parked the car and turned to me, his expression serious. Emma, I know this sounds crazy, but I think I'm falling for you. Fast and hard. My breath caught. Nick, he leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from my face. You don't have to say anything. I just wanted you to know. For once, I wasn't second-guessing myself. I wasn't analyzing, overthinking, or wondering what I was supposed to feel. I just knew that right here with Nick, everything felt exactly as it should. I think I'm falling for you too, I whispered, barely able to contain my smile. And right there, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Nick and I shared our first real kiss, a kiss that felt like a promise, a beginning, and an adventure all wrapped into one. The weeks following our road trip felt like something out of a dream. Nick and I fell into a rhythm, an effortless, beautiful mess of days spent exploring the city, late-night takeout on the couch, and whispered conversations that stretched into the early hours. There were no grand promises, no labels. Just us, enjoying the moment and letting things unfold naturally. For the first time in my life, I wasn't planning, worrying, or wondering what came next. But then, a surprise came knocking on my door, literally. One Sunday morning, as Nick and I were lazily sipping coffee in our pajamas, there was a knock. I opened the door to find Linda standing on my doorstep, looking uncharacteristically frazzled. Linda, I stammered, feeling the weight of her presence immediately. What are you? Emma, she began, cutting me off. I'm here to talk. Please, may I come in? I glanced back at Nick, who was watching curiously, then stepped aside to let her in. She didn't waste any time getting to the point. Emma, she said, taking a seat on the couch, her hands clutching her purse tightly. I came to ask for your forgiveness. I blinked, completely taken aback. Forgiveness? Yes, she said, her voice softening. I realized after you left Mark that I'd crossed a line. I was so focused on protecting him, I didn't see how much I was hurting both of you. And when Mark told me he'd lost you for good, well, it made me question everything. I felt a twinge of surprise, and maybe even pity. For all her pushiness, Linda was Mark's mother, and maybe she'd been blinded by her own fears and insecurities. Linda, I appreciate that, I said cautiously, not sure where this was going. But I don't think there's anything left to fix between Mark and me. She nodded, glancing down at her hands. I understand that. But I didn't come here just for Mark. She paused, looking me squarely in the eye. I came here because I wanted to know if you were truly happy now. I thought I was doing what was best for him, but I see now that I never considered what was best for you. I hesitated, glancing at Nick, who gave me a reassuring nod. I am happy, Linda, I replied honestly. More than I have been in years. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging in relief. Then I suppose I've come here for a bit of closure for myself, she admitted. I needed to see you, to see for myself that leaving Mark was the right choice. And it seems that it was. Linda rose, the remnants of her usual poise barely holding her together. I could tell this wasn't easy for her. I'm sorry, Emma, truly. I hope you'll remember me as more than the overbearing mother who drove you away. I nodded, the weight of years of tension finally lifting. Thank you, Linda. I appreciate it. And I wish you and Mark the best. With a final nod, she walked out, leaving Nick and me in silence. I sank back onto the couch, feeling both exhausted and oddly peaceful. Nick gave me a small smile. Well, that was unexpected. Tell me about it, I replied, shaking my head. But I think it's what I needed. It's like I can finally close that door. He reached over, taking my hand. And now you're free to open new ones. So, any ideas? I grinned, squeezing his hand. Maybe a few. The following weekend, Nick surprised me with a little getaway. A cozy cabin in the mountains. We arrived just before sunset, and the air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine trees and earth. As the evening settled around us, we made a small fire and cozied up on the porch with glasses of wine, wrapped in blankets and each other's warmth. Nick was quiet, staring into the fire. I could sense something on his mind, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Penny for your thoughts? I asked, nudging him playfully. He chuckled, looking down at his glass. Actually, I've been thinking about us. Oh, I said, my heart picking up just a bit. He turned to me, his eyes soft but serious. Emma, these past few months with you have been, well, they've been everything. I wasn't expecting to feel this way, and honestly, it kind of freaks me out how quickly I fell for you. I felt my cheeks flush, but I kept my gaze steady, waiting for him to continue. I know we've both been enjoying the no labels, no pressure thing, he went on, a slight smile playing at his lips. But I can't help wanting more with you, real life, day in and day out, and I'm not talking about moving in or planning a future, just sharing every day, however that looks. He looked at me, vulnerability shining in his eyes. What do you think? I took a deep breath, 1,000 thoughts racing through my mind. But at the end of it all, there was only one answer. Nick, I want that too, I said softly, feeling a surge of happiness. I want you. I want us. He grinned, relief washing over his face. Well, that's good, because I've been wanting to do this for a while. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, hand-carved wooden ring. A simple token, beautifully crafted. This isn't a proposal. It's a promise. A promise that I'm all in. Whatever comes next, I'm here. I felt a lump form in my throat as he slipped the ring onto my finger, the warmth of his hand anchoring me. It's perfect, I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. You're perfect. We sat there, wrapped up in each other, watching the stars blink into existence overhead. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about tomorrow. I wasn't wondering what came next or waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, with exactly who I was meant to be with. And as we drifted off into comfortable silence, the world around us settled, leaving just the two of us, happy in the here and now.